The strange thing wasn't that I got fired. It was how calm I felt when it happened. It was 9:58 a.m. when Jordan's assistant poked her head into my office, smiling that thin, polite smile reserved for public executions, and said he wanted to see me. I didn't ask what it was about. I already knew. The air had shifted that week. Meetings canceled. Files mysteriously misplaced. The compliance audit I'd recommended shelved without discussion. And Jordan, he couldn't look me in the eye during Tuesday's all hands. I'd been waiting for this. I shut my laptop, slid a plain manila folder into my tote, and followed her down the hall. The office hummed with quiet productivity. Phones rang, keyboards tapped, filtered sunlight slid across architectural renderings of subdivisions no one would ever live in. Nothing looked out of place, but under it all, something was wrong. Rotten, really. And I'd seen it. For too long. Jordan Westlake was 33, handsome in that smug, too proud of his watch kind of way, and CEO by inheritance, not merit. His father had built Westlake Geoconsulting over 2 decades. Jordan had been running it into ethical quicksand for the last 5. Still, he wore his authority like armor, tailored suits, forced grins, a golf tan in February. He motioned for me to sit as I stepped into his office. Anika, he began, smiling like someone trying not to gloat, we're restructuring some roles. As of today, we're letting you go. No preamble. No performance review. No HR present. Just a folder pushed across the desk like a peace offering or a weapon, depending on how you looked at it. Just like that, I said. We appreciate your service, he replied, and cleared his throat. But it's time for the company to move in a more streamlined direction. Streamlined. That was rich. I'd spent the better part of 2 years cleaning up after his backdoor deals and doctored reports. The kind of streamlining he meant was fewer obstacles between him and whatever loophole he planned to squeeze through next. I didn't argue. I nodded once and reached into my tote. He flinched slightly. Not from fear, but from uncertainty, the momentary panic of a man used to being in control suddenly unsure of the script. I placed a sealed envelope on his desk. Cream-colored. No markings. You'll want to read that, I said. He looked at it like it might explode. Also, I added, standing, you'll want to call your lawyer. His smile faltered, ever so slightly. Excuse me, I assume the deal closes at 11? I asked, already halfway to the door. He didn't answer. The smirk had melted into something flatter, colder. Not fear, Jordan didn't get afraid. He got annoyed. But something in his eyes told me he knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I walked out without another word. Past reception, past the internship cubicles, past the silent conference room where I'd once pitched a full compliance upgrade and been told, politely, that I was overthinking things. Out into the lot where my rusted Prius sat between a Lexus and a Tesla fitting somehow. I exhaled. Not with relief. Not yet. But with finality. Because by the time Jordan opened that envelope, by the time his legal counsel realized what had been filed with the state, with the county, with the agency, by the time he understood what he'd truly signed off on, it would already be too late. He fired me at 10 a.m. By 10:30, I owned his company. When I first joined Westlake Geoconsulting, I wasn't looking to burn anything down. It had been a quiet career up until then, 15 years in environmental compliance, most of it spent reviewing permits, filing impact assessments, and reminding men twice my salary why ignoring stormwater runoff regulations was a bad idea. Not exactly glamorous, but meaningful. Or at least, it used to be. Westlake recruited me after a well-regarded remediation project I managed in Napa. The offer came with a pay bump, flexible hours, and a promise that they were turning a new leaf in compliance. I wanted to believe that. I'd just come off a burnout spell and thought maybe I could do more good from the inside, help shape ethical policy at a firm that claimed it was ready to grow up. That hope lasted maybe 3 months. From the outside, Westlake looked like the real thing. Sleek offices in Oakland's waterfront district, LEED-certified paperless systems, even a rooftop garden no one ever used. They spoke all the right environmental buzzwords. But inside, the rot was subtler. Death by small decisions. Corners shaved like pencil tips, shavings you wouldn't notice unless you'd spent years sharpening. The first red flag was a soil report. I'd been reviewing field data for a proposed hillside development in Contra Costa County when I noticed the lead levels didn't match prior samples from the same site. The numbers were just low enough to avoid triggering mitigation. Too perfect. When I cross-referenced the GPS tags, I found they didn't correspond to the documented sample locations. I flagged it in the report notes, quietly, just in case it was an honest mistake. The next week, my comment had been removed before submission. The final report bore my name, but not my warning. I confronted the project manager, a wiry guy named Mason who'd been at Westlake since before Jordan's takeover. He shrugged it off. Developers don't pay us to throw red flags, Anika. They want solutions. Solutions don't mean fake data, I said. He smiled in that way engineers do when they think they know more than you. It's not fake. It's adaptive. That phrase stuck with me. Adaptive. As if data were a thing to be bent into shape rather than observed. I started noticing other things. Air quality impact models run with outdated software. Species assessments copied from adjacent parcels and recycled with minor edits. Entire field surveys conducted in a single day when the itinerary would have taken 3. And somehow, these always coincided with high-value, high-pressure deals, the kind where Westlake's signature on a clean report meant shovels in dirt by Monday. I didn't say anything. Not yet. I just started documenting. Every discrepancy, every overwritten comment, every meeting where a junior staffer looked uncomfortable and said nothing, I made notes. I kept backups. Paper when necessary. Redundant cloud logs. Quiet insurance against what I feared was becoming a pattern, not an anomaly. Jordan floated above it all. He didn't touch the reports, not directly. But he cultivated the culture. He praised teams that hit deadlines no matter what and berated those who flagged complications. He called me thorough, but only in that vaguely patronizing tone that meant slower than I'd like. He never said cut corners, but his meaning was always clear. And then came the Bayview Ridge project. A massive mixed-use development slated for a coastal bluff outside Santa Cruz. Environmentally sensitive, politically volatile, and worth millions. Westlake had the inside track on approvals if the reports held up. I was assigned lead compliance review. The pressure started before I even opened the files. Mason told me off the record that Jordan wanted a clean path forward. No surprises. No delays. The survey data was a mess. Coastal erosion was understated. A known endangered frog species had been entirely omitted. I found 3 references to an old Phase 1 assessment from 2009 being recycled like it was new. I scheduled a meeting. Jordan didn't attend. Instead, he sent a young project coordinator who stared at his tablet the whole time and said things like risk-balanced optimization. I emailed my concerns. Formally. Twice. I used language that couldn't be misread. I included documentation. No one responded. The final report was filed without my sign-off. It listed me as internal reviewer. My signature had been scanned from an earlier document. I only found out when a colleague forwarded me a link to the public filing. That was when I knew. Westlake wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as designed, built to absorb liability through plausible deniability while passing bad data off to clients who wanted deniability even more. A symbiosis of shortcuts. Still, I waited. Observed. I told myself I was gathering more information, preparing to file something more substantial, something they couldn't explain away. But part of me just didn't want to believe it had gone that deep. I'd worked too hard for too long to end up here, in a company that turned compliance into theater. The quiet storm kept building. Not in outbursts, but in inches. In decisions made behind glass doors, in reports that whispered lies in legalese. And I stopped trying to fix it. I started preparing to expose it. There's a point where small things stop being small. Not because they grow louder or messier, but because they start to rhyme. It began with the soil data, then the recycled species reports. But once I started paying attention, truly paying attention, I began to see that the real story wasn't in the errors themselves. It was in their repetition. The same developers, the same consultants, the same deviations in language, timing, scope. You could almost template it, shave 5 days off the field work, run the outdated emissions model, slap on a rushed QA pass, and push it out under deadline. Clean reports, dirty footprints. They'd gotten good at making it look normal. I created a spreadsheet in my personal cloud, discreet, private, unassuming. Each tab was a project I hadn't reviewed directly but had access to through shared drives. I pulled metadata from PDFs, compared edit timestamps, cross-referenced initials in the footnotes. I wasn't hacking anything, just observing. Quietly. There were always just enough buffers to preserve deniability. A sentence tweaked here. A signature nudge there. One report claimed that seasonal wetlands had been dry for years, based on field notes that conveniently omitted rainfall from the previous week. Another used a 3-year-old traffic study for a new highway-adjacent warehouse project, ignoring population growth in the area. None of it would make headlines, but all of it chipped away at the truth. The real trouble was how normal it felt to everyone else. I'd walk through the office and hear jokes about optimistic mapping. See interns pressured to meet absurd mapping deadlines with incomplete survey data. Watch engineers cut down public comment summaries to bullet points that couldn't possibly represent the nuance of community concerns. It was like we'd all been taught to see the map instead of the terrain, to speak in deliverables, not consequences. I remember one morning in particular. I overheard a project lead briefing a junior staffer. If it's borderline, round down. You're not lying, you're estimating conservatively. The kid laughed nervously. Took the note. Conservatively. That word stung. It had once meant caution, prudence. Now it meant plausible fiction. I didn't confront anyone. Not yet. Confrontation is noisy, and noise only gives people time to dig trenches. Instead, I studied the culture that kept these gears turning. I noticed who Jordan promoted, always the ones who made problems disappear, never the ones who flagged them. I tracked when QA reviews were most likely to be bypassed, typically in the last 48 hours before a municipal deadline. I watched which third-party consultants were always brought in to rubber stamp a difficult site. One in particular, Garrison and Yule, showed up on nearly every project flagged high priority. Their assessments were always brief, always favorable, and always matched the outcome the client wanted. When I asked Mason why we used them so often, he replied, "They get it." That was all he said. They get it. I started to feel like I was watching a choreography. Everyone knew their steps. The only mistake I'd made was assuming it was improvisation. Of course, I wasn't totally invisible. Once or twice, someone would warn me. A soft word in the break room. A too long glance at the copier. One colleague, Amanda, from procurement, quietly asked if I was still keeping notes. I didn't ask how she knew. Just nodded. She never brought it up again. Even the systems were complicit. Our internal tracking software didn't flag late edits as long as the file name stayed the same. SharePoint logs were routinely purged every 90 days to streamline server load. That was what they said. But I'd already started exporting weekly digests of document activity, archiving them off-platform. It wasn't enough to catch mistakes, you had to prove intention. Pattern. Consistency. And intention hides best in plain sight. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd taken this job hoping to influence policy, to work upstream. But what I'd found was a company designed to operate just downstream enough to blur the lines. By the time a violation emerged, it looked like a shadow of someone else's decision. And yet, there was one flaw in Jordan's empire: arrogance. He believed in systems, not people. He believed in speed, not scrutiny. And he believed, truly believed, that no one would take the time to untangle the threads. But I had time. I had patience. And I had every quiet moment he and his team thought didn't matter. Every after-hours edit. Every redline section mysteriously accepted the next day. Every conservative estimate that nudged a project past regulatory review. What they didn't know was that while they were revising the story, I was keeping the original draft. One day, I opened my tracking spreadsheet and realized I had over 70 entries across 18 projects. It wasn't noise anymore. It was a pattern. Jordan Westlake didn't walk into a room. He entered it like he owned the oxygen. You could hear it in his footsteps, confident, clipped, never hurried. You could see it in how people adjusted when he passed, straighter backs, quicker nods, a polite hush trailing behind him like cologne. He was the kind of man who remembered names just long enough to use them for leverage and forgot them just as quickly once they stopped being useful. In another life, he might have been charming. Here, he was dangerous precisely because he thought he still was. We met on my second day. He came into the compliance bullpen with 2 almond milk lattes and a broad, camera-ready grin. "Anika Rao," he said, extending one of the cups. "The brains from Napa." I thanked him and noticed the logo Starbucks, not the local roaster he claimed to support in company memos. A small thing, but it set the tone. Jordan made a performance out of leadership. He loved the optics, sustainable sourced wood tables, slick company retreats, newsletter blurbs about our mission to protect and empower. But when it came to substance, his attention thinned. He attended quarterly compliance briefings like a man visiting an art gallery he didn't quite understand, appreciative of the vocabulary, impatient with the details. He rarely spoke directly about ethics. He talked about efficiency, client alignment, navigating friction points. He framed regulations not as safeguards, but as obstacles to manage. His favorite phrase was, "Let's not get in our own way," which, in practice, meant anyone raising a concern was holding up progress. I once asked him, during an elevator ride, how he saw the future of environmental compliance in real estate. He chuckled, glanced at his watch, and said, honestly, automated and optional. Then he winked, like he'd just told me a harmless joke. But it wasn't harmless. And it wasn't a joke. Under his leadership, the company shifted. Long-term analysts were pushed out in favor of hungry MBAs with growth plans and polished decks. He created a new client solutions team to liaise between compliance and business development, translation, spin. He disbanded the internal audit review process and outsourced it to a third-party firm that shared a board member with one of our major clients. Every check became a handshake. Every gate, a revolving door. And he had no idea I was watching. He didn't see me as a threat. To Jordan, I was one of those people companies kept around for appearances, someone to cite when questioned about due diligence. He introduced me at staff meetings as our watchdog, always with a grin that said he didn't mean it as a compliment. Once, after I flagged a glaring data omission in a wetlands report, he patted my shoulder and said, "I admire your consistency. Not everyone has the stomach for red tape." That was the closest he ever came to acknowledging our conflict. But there was something else about him, something more corrosive than his arrogance. He believed he was still the good guy. He saw himself as a modern reformer, someone saving a stalling business from bureaucratic stagnation. In his mind, we weren't dodging rules. We were innovating past them. He could talk for hours about green tech, carbon offsets, circular economies. And then, with the same breath, approve a site plan that buried endangered habitat under luxury condos. It wasn't malice. It was insulation. He surrounded himself with people who reinforced the story he told about himself. People who didn't just execute his vision, but echoed it back to him louder and shinier. He didn't manipulate them. He didn't need to. They wanted to believe. He just made it easy. And in that ecosystem of loyalty and surface-level optimism, I was a foreign object. Not loud, not disobedient, just resistant. The wrong kind of stillness. By the time he fired me, I don't think he even remembered most of what I'd flagged over the years. He didn't see the through line. He didn't care to. As far as he knew, I was just another compliance officer with a grudge. He never realized I'd been cataloging his shortcuts like case law. He never imagined that I understood his weaknesses better than he understood his own. And that was the difference between us. He trusted image. I trusted evidence. It started, like most legal things do, with a conversation I didn't entirely want to have. Her name was Nora Klein, a mid-level investigator for the California Environmental Protection Bureau. I'd found her email buried in a decade-old interagency memo from my time in the public sector. I hesitated for weeks before I reached out. I wasn't sure what I was reporting yet, just patterns, gut feelings, a growing mountain of almosts and maybes. But Nora didn't laugh me off. She listened. I met her for coffee in Emeryville, far from the office, far from anyone who might recognize us. She wore no badge, no clipboard, just a wool coat and a quiet look that said she'd heard things like this before. Don't start with conclusions, she said, after I handed her a sanitized packet of reports. Start with facts. Be boring. Boring gets attention. So I was boring. Over the next 6 weeks, I built a catalog of discrepancies, dates, signatures, mismatched datasets, nothing inflammatory, just what was. I organized everything the way a regulator would want to see it: source files, context notes, audit trails. My evenings became casework. I stopped attending happy hours. I stopped explaining why. I didn't tell Nora everything, not yet. Just enough for her to assign it an internal reference number. Enough to avoid the bin marked disgruntled employee. She never promised an outcome. Just scrutiny. That was enough. The second part of the path came through a friend of a friend. A quiet legal mind named Jules Herrera, a whistleblower attorney who'd spent most of her career defending scientists and safety engineers who'd poked the wrong bear. She didn't speak in big, dramatic terms. She asked questions. Precise ones. About contracts, communications, internal systems. I gave her everything I had. She reviewed it with clinical calm. No, this is outrageous, no flattery. Just one raised eyebrow at a backdated impact summary that had 3 authors and no editor listed. This is systemic, she said. But it's not enough. Not yet. She was right. Regulatory violations get headlines. But legal action? Legal action requires intent, and intent doesn't hide in numbers, it hides in behavior. So we changed tack. We started building a timeline: emails, meeting invites, performance reviews, memos where I was pressured, subtly, always subtly, to sign off. Every time I pushed back. Every time I was ignored. And then, the land deal. A proposed $50 million development on a wetlands-adjacent parcel in San Benito County. The biggest deal Westlake had ever landed. The cornerstone of their quarterly investor call. And it was built, Jules and I both confirmed it, on a chain of altered assessments. From start to finish, the documentation had been massaged into compliance. It was the hinge, the pressure point. The contract hadn't closed yet. But it would soon. Jules leaned in, quiet and serious. If they fire you before it closes, and you filed under whistleblower protection with a time-stamped record showing material misrepresentation, they could lose the deal, I finished. More than that, she said. You could trigger operational control review, depending on their bylaws. I blinked. What kind of review? She showed me. Buried deep in Westlake's old operating agreement, leftover from when they were still private and family-run, was a clause. If company officers were found complicit in fraudulent environmental certification that materially impacted a major contract, any internal compliance lead with documented objections could initiate emergency review proceedings. It had never been used. It was still active. I stared at the clause for a long time. There it was. My way through, not to destroy them, not to punish, but to stop it. Legally. Cleanly. A keyhole of leverage that existed because someone, somewhere, had once worried this might happen. I didn't need to shout. I just needed to follow the rules better than they did. The Westlake, Cerro Vista deal had all the markers of a corporate high: press releases, drone renderings, and a countdown clock in the executive suite. $50 million in land, permits, and projected development fees. A coastal adjacent parcel, long contested for its ecological fragility, suddenly cleared for commercial use thanks to a battery of favorable impact assessments. Assessments I hadn't reviewed. That was the first red flag. I wasn't officially excluded, just overlooked. My name was left off email threads, folders mysteriously reorganized, meeting invites routed to an outdated calendar. I was told they were moving quickly. I didn't push. Not yet. Let them forget I was watching. The land itself, Parcel 14B, was known among conservation planners as a no-go. Shifting water tables, migratory corridors, suspected vernal pools. But the reports, signed by third-party consultants Jordan liked to call reliable, declared the land dry, stable, and non-sensitive. Clean enough for concrete. I started pulling the draft filings. The ecosystem survey cited a 2008 document from a neighboring parcel marked as historical comparison, but with no attribution. The wetlands delineation was mapped during a drought and ignored satellite data from the wetter months. A key mitigation measure, fencing for amphibian migration, was listed as not applicable, though records showed sightings of the California tiger salamander in that exact zone the year before. And there, buried in the compliance appendix, was my name. Not as reviewer, as certifier. I hadn't even opened the report before that moment. When I confronted Mason, he brushed it off. It's just boilerplate. Legal needs a name. You've reviewed similar reports. It's not like anything's technically inaccurate. But I didn't review this one. He smiled thinly. Look, no one's expecting you to sign off. Just don't make it a problem, okay? The client's ready to close. The next morning, I brought the file to Jules. This is the trigger, she said. Everything we'd built pointed here. The land. The money. The altered reports. The forged attribution. It wasn't just a pattern anymore. It was fraud, papered in procedural makeup. And the timing was critical. The closing was set for Friday at 11 a.m. If the deal went through, the lie would become a fact and my leverage would evaporate. That's when Jules reminded me of the clause. We'd found it weeks earlier, a legal relic from when Westlake was smaller and more cautious. It stated, in precise and forgotten legalese, that any internal officer with documented, unresolved objections to a compliance process materially affecting contract value could petition for operational control review, provided those objections were filed before a triggering transaction. In plain English, if I filed the right challenge before the deal closed, I could freeze it. And, temporarily, if the challenge met the statutory burden of material endangerment of public trust, I could be granted interim oversight powers until the review was complete. It sounded improbable, but Jules had already confirmed its legality with 2 corporate specialists. It's a nuclear button, she said, but it's real. That afternoon, I finished compiling the last of my evidence, signed PDFs, audit logs, discrepancy memos, metadata trails. Jules filed the formal whistleblower complaint with the state. I filed an internal notice of objection, time-stamped, documented, and delivered to Westlake's general counsel by certified courier. And then I waited. From my office window, I could see the marketing team setting up for the Friday announcement. Branded balloons, a pop-up step-and-repeat banner. They were already celebrating. They had no idea what was coming. They didn't read the bylaws. But I had. I arrived at the office that Friday before anyone else. 6:45 a.m. The streets were still wet from an overnight drizzle, and the building's glass facade reflected the gray light like a held breath. Inside, the reception lights were dimmed, and the silence was cavernous. I walked in without being noticed. On my desk was the last folder, sealed, labeled, and ready. Inside were copies of the filings, the state's acknowledgement of my whistleblower complaint, the official notice of regulatory review from the Department of Environmental Protection, and my petition invoking the clause in Westlake's bylaws. Each document had a timestamp. Each timestamp was before 10 a.m. I made 1 more copy set and walked them to the building's mail drop. 1 to the state. 1 to the developer's legal team. 1 to our board's independent director. And 1 personally addressed to Jordan Westlake, waiting in the center of his desk. Back upstairs, the office was waking up. Mason walked in with his usual clatter, paper coffee cup, cell already glued to his ear, chuckling at nothing. The marketing team was hanging a banner in the conference room, new ground, new future. There was champagne on ice in the staff kitchen. The clock ticked toward 10. At 9:57, I got the email. Please see me in my office. Jordan. Of course. He didn't even say, please, in person. I walked down the hall slowly, counting each step. The door was open. He stood behind his desk, arms folded, his jaw tight like a man trying to stay in control of something already slipping. Anika, he said. Have a seat. I didn't. I stood in front of the chair, hands relaxed at my sides. I'll keep it short, he said. We're letting you go. No pretense of dialogue. No HR rep. No rationale beyond performance concerns. A clean sweep before the deal closed. He thought he was tying off loose ends. I nodded. Then I placed a cream envelope on his desk. You'll want to read that. His smirk wavered. What is it? Due process, I said. You still believe in that, right? He opened it. His face shifted, Not with fear, Jordan didn't do fear, but with calculation. Page 1, the state's notice. Page 2, the regulatory hold. Page 3, the clause. His eyes flicked up. You think this'll stop the deal? It already has. At that moment, his assistant stepped in, pale. Jordan, there's someone here from the Environmental Protection Bureau. And, legal from Cerro Vista. The clock behind him read 10:29. I turned and walked out, past the conference room, past the champagne, past the interns lining up for group photos. The music playing over the speakers stuttered as someone fumbled with the playlist. Behind me, I heard footsteps and voices starting to rise. But I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The conference room looked different when no one was pretending. Gone were the smiles, the congratulatory handshakes. The balloon arch sagged, half deflated, and someone had quietly closed the blinds. The champagne bottles remained unopened on the credenza, a visual reminder that the party had been planned before the paperwork was in order. A few staff had scattered. Others stood frozen, whispering behind raised hands. They didn't know what to say, so they said nothing at all. Jordan was at the far end of the table, shoulders squared like a man clinging to the illusion of control. Beside him sat the Cerro Vista liaison, tight-lipped, gray-suited, staring into her phone with narrowed eyes. Across from them, the state regulator, Nora, laid out the compliance filings with calm, practiced efficiency. She glanced at me when I entered, but said nothing. She didn't need to. My part was already in motion. Jordan gestured at the papers. This is a misunderstanding, he said, voice flat. It's procedural friction. Nothing that affects the merits of the deal. Nora didn't flinch. The deal cannot proceed while there's an active whistleblower review concerning material misrepresentation in your certification records. That's not friction. That's statutory freeze. He looked to the Cerro Vista liaison, hoping for backup, but she didn't offer any. She'd already seen the filings her legal team had. She was here to confirm the worst, not debate it. Jordan turned to me. You blindsided us. I followed procedure, I said evenly. You had concerns. You could have come to me. I did. Repeatedly. He opened his mouth to counter, but the weight of documentation on the table silenced him. I saw it then, his mind spinning through excuses, none of them useful now. He wasn't used to being met with structure, only resistance. This wasn't a confrontation. This was a correction. This is a serious accusation, he said finally. It's not an accusation, I replied. It's a record. That landed harder than I expected. He leaned back, eyes narrowing. Not fear, not anger, just realization. That the chessboard wasn't his anymore. That the rules he thought were flexible had calcified around him, slow and invisible until they became iron. The board's independent director joined the room mid-meeting. She asked 2 questions. Had the certification process been tampered with? And had an internal objection been filed before the transaction? Yes. And yes. The clause activated immediately. Interim oversight would shift to a regulatory trustee, someone outside both corporate and government control. But for the next 72 hours, I would serve as internal compliance steward under emergency protocol. Limited power. No headlines. Just enough to halt movement, protect records, and initiate formal review. Jordan didn't yell. He didn't protest. He just stared past me, mouth set, as if he could will the clock backward. But it was 10:43 now, and the game was already over. For 72 hours, I was the most unlikely thing Westlake Geoconsulting had ever seen, the quiet woman in charge. Not with sweeping authority, nothing cinematic, but with just enough leverage to freeze movement. My badge still worked. My emails stopped bouncing. The servers were locked down under regulatory supervision, and every project file flagged in my complaint was sequestered for review. I didn't send a company-wide memo. I didn't need to. People got the message. Mason avoided my floor entirely. 2 junior analysts quietly emailed me copies of their untouched report drafts, complete with revision notes that had mysteriously disappeared from the official record. One even apologized. I told him not to. I knew how it worked. Fear of losing your job makes people fluent in silence. On Monday morning, The regulatory trustee arrived, an external consultant with clean credentials and a background in environmental law. Her role was to oversee transition, not vengeance. The goal wasn't to tear the company down. It was to stop it from burying itself. The board convened an emergency session that afternoon. Jordan was removed from day-to-day operations pending investigation. His personal counsel issued a stiff, deflective statement about temporary misunderstandings and politically motivated audits. But inside the building, his name had already lost its weight. What had once been power now sounded like risk. Cerro Vista pulled out of the deal. Officially, they cited timeline uncertainty. Unofficially, their legal team made it clear they wouldn't touch a project tied to regulatory fraud. Investors panicked. The firm's quarterly projections collapsed overnight. And me? I was offered a formal position as interim compliance director. I declined. I wasn't there to lead a company. I was there to stop one from breaking the law. That job was done. What came next needed someone who could build, not just prevent collapse. Someone who could teach the people who stayed why it mattered. I recommended a colleague from outside, someone ethical, steady, and impossible to intimidate. I spent the rest of the week cleaning out my office. No one stopped me. A few nodded. One young staffer offered to help carry a box. I told him thank you and meant it. Jules met me for coffee on my last day. I asked her what came next. Well, she said, you might have a case for wrongful termination, retaliation, maybe even civil damages under whistleblower statutes. I shook my head. I don't want a payout. You earned one. Maybe, I said. But that's not the precedent I care about. She smiled at that, a rare thing from her. Then I think you already got what you came for. That night, I drove home without checking my phone. I didn't need updates or headlines. I didn't want revenge. I wanted integrity. Accountability. For the system to work, just once, as it was meant to. And it had. Not perfectly. Not loudly. But enough. Enough to remind me why I got into this work in the first place. Not for glory. Not even for justice. For truth, preserved quietly in documents that couldn't lie. I never went back to corporate work. Not out of bitterness, just clarity. Some doors, once closed, don't need reopening. Instead, I began consulting with small environmental nonprofits, helping them understand the very systems that once tried to drown me in their vagueness. Zoning ordinances, public record requests, land use loopholes, the bureaucratic codebooks most people avoid. I taught them how to read between the lines, how to recognize when a report was too clean, a permit too fast, a timeline too convenient. It wasn't glamorous. There were no awards. But it was good work. Work that kept me grounded. Sometimes people asked if I ever regretted it, blowing the whistle, walking away from a powerful position I could have held onto. They assumed I did it for revenge. Or principle. Or both. But it was never about bringing someone down. It was about stopping something from rising on a lie. Jordan's name faded from headlines after a few months. No criminal charges, just civil penalties, investor lawsuits, and a permanently damaged reputation. The company survived, trimmed and bruised, restructured under new leadership. Whether it learned anything, I can't say. But I left a paper trail strong enough that no one could deny what had happened. That's the thing about knowledge. It doesn't shout. It doesn't fight. It waits. It builds. It holds steady under pressure. And when the moment comes, when the loud men in suits start swinging wildly, thinking the rules bend to their will, it doesn't flinch. It simply shows up. Complete, intact, undeniable.